There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Free Kiwis. It's the podcast for free Kiwi thinking and new New Zealand ideas. And today we have another very special guest. This is Ella Whelan. She now works for the Academy of Ideas. Some of you may know her work through Spiked magazine, a wonderful online sort of liberal and free speech website. She's also the author of a book, What Women Want, Fun, Freedom, and an End to Feminism. Wonderfully alliterative title. So welcome to Free Kiwis.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I thought we'd just start out talking about Spiked. I know you just said that you're no longer officially assistant editor at Spiked, but you did work there for a long time and you're one of the main voices on Spiked. I wonder if you could just talk about the origins of Spiked, because as I understand it, it came from a sort of radical left-wing website, and it's sort of become a more liberal, free speech-oriented website. So, and we're very keen to talk to free speechers of the left, because we've been talking to a lot of free speechers of the right. So, what's the Spike sort of take on all of this? How do you have a free speech take? I mean, it's a bit of a weird question. It would have seemed a really weird question only 10 or 20 years ago, but what's the sort of left-wing case for free speech?
Well, so it's funny that lots of people think that Spiked has gone on a journey and moved from one position to another. But in actual fact, lots of us say that Spiked has remained the same, and the politics of Spiked has, in principle, in terms of freedom of speech, has always been there. And actually a lot of the things that we wrote in 2001 when it was set up as the first political online magazine, and it was pioneering in terms of responding to what the kind of birth of the internet and what that would mean for democracy and free speech. And actually it's just the world has changed and politics has changed around us, and that sort of means that in a strange way lots of people now view a magazine that was founded by members of editors of Living Marxism, now see us as right wing because we find strange bedfellows with people on the right who are equally as interested and principled about freedom of speech. So it's not that we haven't been on a journey or switched sides or moved from left to liberal necessarily. I think that it's just that the way in which we describe those terms these days has become more confused. It's very difficult to have quite clear lines between left and right anymore, between liberal and conservative, because everything's gotten a bit muddy. But if you want to argue for, to talk about the left-wing case for freedom of speech, it really is very simple, which is, and has become more actually easier to define today after movements like the Brexit referendum in the UK, or even things like the election of Trump in America, which is that the left argument for free speech is really based on appreciation of the importance of democracy. So the whole idea of freedom of speech is that not just that it's beneficial for everyone to be able to scream their nonsense in the public square, but that actually most of the time people don't scream nonsense in the public square, that actually the freedom of speech of your average Joe or Jane out on the street is often more important to be heard and politically more radical, more progressive, more transformative than the messaging from elites. And so, whereas throughout history would have had conservative censorship, either around kind of protecting the status quo, around being allergic to movements towards sexual radicalism or whatever it is, it would have been people on the right who were banning books or stopping exhibitions or clamping down on protests. The reason why today it seems like a lot of people on the liberal left are doing it is because the liberal left has I think has moved towards being suspicious of democracy, even being afraid of democracy, being afraid of publics having a voice. And so really, I think for us and for me, the left-wing case for freedom of speech is intertwined and inextricably linked with a belief in radical populist democracy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It seems to me that a number of things have happened in the last 20 years, one of which is actually in some ways, the collapse of a simple dualism between left and right. I mean, maybe that was always simplistic. But when I listen to somebody like Brendan O'Neill, I find very little to disagree with them about almost anything. I certainly share his lockdown skepticism, and I guess the other thing that seems to have happened, maybe especially in the UK, is that no, I think it's more than just in the UK. I think the whole woke movement, as it were, has sort of abandoned the traditional left-wing focus on the working classes, and become actually very preoccupied with elite concerns. And so that's one thing that's happened. But it seems to me as well that actually when we talk about the political space that people occupy, perhaps we need to distinguish at least two different axes within that space. One we might call authoritarian versus libertarian, and the other might be more concerned with economics, which is perhaps where the traditional left-right divide has occurred, that one is more pro-business and the other pro-welfare, this kind of thing. What do you think about that analysis of the political space?
Yeah, I mean, I think at Spiked, there's been discussions about how to define our politics in the 21st century when everything is so muddied and the axes are all kind of skewed, and it's very difficult to, the fact that I, as someone who considered themselves on the far left, would have, in terms of economics, but also actually socially and culturally, would find myself completely in alignment with some people who would define themselves as, not exactly far right, but as right-leaning, in terms of economics or even actually socially, because of the issue of democracy. And we've decided that, some people in Spiked have decided that actually the most clear-cut way to describe our politics now is that we're pro-democracy, that we're Democrats. Not with a capital D in the American sense, but in the kind of abstract, in that all the old ways of defining things and end up feeling superficial when you put them into a contemporary context. So in the UK, when people talk about left wing in the UK now, it sort of is a shorthand for either the Labour Party or for Jeremy Corbyn, who was leader of the Labour Party a number of years ago. And that is just so kind of wafer thin understanding of what it is to be left. The Labour politics is extremely extremely superficial. It's all about kind of the many, not the few, helping the poor. This kind of like very patronising approach to working class people, and actually more importantly, it's a very middle class way of understanding what it means to be left, because it's all about sort of helping the environment, being nice to animals, and running a few food banks. And it doesn't have any of that transformative assertion that actually working class people should be at the forefront of a political movement. It's all about Emily Thornberry and Jeremy Corbyn and people who run, who are MPs for Islington constituencies, which is like posh London constituencies, should be the ones who deliver the rights and the freedoms to the little people. And so when you say left in the UK, it's just useless now. It kind of doesn't really mean anything. Or you have to spend 5 minutes at the pub explaining that you're left, but not like that left person, and blah blah blah. It's like the Monty Python kind of scene. But I mean, I know that left-wing politics have quite often been like that. That's not necessarily anything new. But I think also even on the right now, you have the people like the late Roger Scruton, who would have symbolised a kind of intellectual conservatism that had some grounding, had some not exactly policies behind it, but you sort of understood what that meant and could engage with it. But now the term right wing has come to mean anyone that's just a bit nasty. It's just anyone who's, people throw it around like anyone who's their political opponent is right wing. It doesn't really have any grounding in any kind of area of material politics. It's just, if they're not a Labour supporter, they're right wing, or if they're not a lefty, they're right wing, and so it's kind of useless. And it's very difficult to make that argument to move away from those understandings, because obviously in the abstract they still have some merit. I mean, like, are you for a welfare state? There are simple questions that can put you on either side of the axis. But I think that one of the main problems of contemporary politics is a kind of this muddy confusion in terms, and this inability to actually get beyond the superficiality of it and think about ideas and think about any kind of future movement. And so I think that's why we've sort of moved away from left and right and moved towards radical democracy, whether you are a technocrat or a Democrat. And actually, as it happens, lots of the people on the left in America and the UK and in other countries, actually pretty much across Europe, the left now inhabits a kind of middle-class technocratic position. So that's a very convoluted way of saying that I'm sort of done with left and right.
Yeah, I think one of the things you touched on there is, we didn't say it in so many words, but there's also, I mean, it's a phrase that I often read on Spiked, is the PC left. And that's interesting because the kind of taboos that are associated today with political correctness, I think in the past they would have been associated with something like polite language. And controls on speech, as far as I can see, they're very rarely something which comes from the masses. It's usually people who think, one should speak in a certain way. They're the ones who tend to want to clamp down or control the way people are talking. And it's very striking at the moment. I mean, I don't know, I haven't sort of done any kind of, I haven't seen any studies of this, but it is striking how often the people who are shut down are some very, they seem to be some very sort of traditionally working class types. The name escapes me of the comic who was recently banned from, I think, a Sheffield council venue. What was he called?
Chubby Brown.
Chubby Brown, and I had no idea who he was, and I clicked on his YouTube and I was watching some of that, and I mean, it's pretty ribald stuff, but it's very clear to me. I mean, that's a very kind of working class kind of thing, and so to shut that down, I mean, to me it seems pretty obviously elitist. A lot of this seems to come from that direction.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that PC culture, or identity politics, or woke, or whatever it is, this kind of term that people use, it's incredibly bourgeois. It's just it's drippingly middle class, because, and I have a really good example of this was quite a number of years ago now. I interviewed Camille Paglia when I was in America, and we were talking really about things like trans and feminism and different areas of identity politics, and we were talking about kind of street harassment, because it was at the time when Me Too and all of that was sort of bubbling away, and the anti-harassment campaigns. And she gave this really nice example where she was saying that, working class Latino or working class African American, or, these kind of like normal working class neighborhoods were full of people using derogatory language, what they would call blue language. They were like shouting stuff at each other in the street, shouting back. A man would say, "Hey, sexy," and a woman would say, "Oh, get out of here." There was a total ease of the way in which people talked to one another. And sure, people overstepped the line, and sure that there was bad stuff in there, but actually the thing that gets lost with this kind of a policing of PC culture is an easiness in the way in which people talk. And I'm from working class Irish family, London Irish family, and the kind of central pins of all of our relationship is an ability to piss take, is an ability to be kind of light touch with our personalities, with our identities. So it doesn't, there is sort of no zone of your being that isn't up for grabs, and that's actually a real expression of affection. It's a really wonderful way of being. It's not uptight. I mean, and then I meet some of my English friends' families, and I think, God, all of you got a rod up your ass, because it's just, and it's very uncomfortable, and it's. I think the point that Paglia was making is that there is this belief among middle-class commentators and middle-class politicians and people who are the kind of movers and shakers in the world of PC culture, who get things banned, who are able to pronounce from on high, that there is this kind of bubbling mass of prejudice and bias and awfulness, and people are actually really monsters who can't relate to one another, and what their job is to socially manage our interpersonal relationships. I mean, even on an extreme level, like in Scotland, at the moment, there has been talk, or there is talk, or it's actually happened, that there was a suggestion that Alexa, you know, those machines in people's homes, would listen out and fight, that police would be able to tap into Alexas in order to find out whether people were engaging in hate speech in their own homes. So there's this sense that we have to be managed. And really the only answer to them, what Palia said to me is, you know, none of these people, and she was talking about these kind of preppy middle-class women in universities talking about how using the word babe is so kind of oppressive, but none of these middle-class stuffs have ever actually gone out and gone to a normal pub or been in the street or met people and realized that they're not just rabid bigots, but that actually there's a complexity to the way in which working class people talk to one another, that it's not just like all hatred and bias, but that actually it's far more open, far more, you know, I made this point already, far more radical, far more progressive in terms of it's much more integrated. People actually interact in a really genuine way rather than this very kind of polite, refined sheen of interaction that's often very impenetrable in PC culture. The whole thing about PC culture is it's dishonest, because what you're doing is continuously self-censoring, and it's not that like everyone really wants to say something on PC to one another, but you feel like you're walking on eggshells. You have to double think everything, and that's living in bad faith. That's a really way of citizens interacting with each other.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's actually what you're talking about, that kind of working class tough-mindedness, really, of just being able to say what you think and take it on the chin. It's actually a very respectful way to communicate, because when we communicate like that, it's like saying, well, I know you can, you know, take a bit of banter. You're not some fragile creature that needs to be mollycoddled. And it seems to me that probably comes from the fact that, you know, working class life can be pretty hard, and so people are fairly tough, and in that sense the kind of woke PC thing could really only come from the comfortable classes, because how fragile do you have to be to want to police language to that extent? I didn't know that about what you were saying about the Alexa being spying on people, essentially. I mean, that's kind of full Orwell, isn't it? That's you couldn't get much more, you know, much closer to the 1984 scenario of the Big Brother listening to every word than that.
I was going to say, Michael, I wonder how much of this is I mean, it is. I think it is I started this whole train of conversation. So I mean, it is a sort of upper class thing or upper middle class thing, sort of controlling the masses. I think these speech norms. But I also wonder the extent to which it's specifically an importation. It strikes me as a very American thing, because when Ella was talking, I had these great memories of living in Britain, and it was all about piss taking, as you say, and friendship was specifically about taking the piss out of one another. And when I went to the States to do my PhD, I mean, I was at a fancy pants American university, and immediately I realized that it was a bit different there. And people write different genealogies of this wokeness, but I often wonder, because the thing is that the British upper middle classes can also be titanically un-PC. And the British upper classes can be titanically un-PC as well. So I wonder the extent to which this is sort of a specifically American or North American thing, because it's in Canada, it's rife as well. And the PC stuff started in Canada much earlier than it did in the UK. So where does that come from? Is that sort of a specifically North American Puritanism? Is that the roots of it?
I think, yeah, it's well, you know, what happened, I think, both in America and the UK, although UK left liberals, as they're kind of called, I find that's the easiest way to describe them, you know, people who are not really left-wing and not really liberal in the abstract sense, but so this kind of like PC world is, I call them left liberals, is they've always been sort of one step behind America and aping America. I mean, a trend that happens in American campuses often then comes in the National Union of Students in the UK then brings in a policy that's similar, and it's always a little bit behind, but kind of very in a mimicking sense like America. But they're, you know, not to, at risk of giving a very ineffectual and probably not quite right plotted history. You had radical movements, you know, in America, the civil rights movement, in the UK as well, women's liberatory movements, gay rights movements throughout the 60s, 70s, into the 80s. You had like discussions within the women's liberation movement about, you know, quite radical things, the things like the pill, material things like the pill coming in. You had all this social change and upheaval, ripping up old norms, you know, and generational divides opening up in many ways, in positive ways, you know, moving away from the kind of stuffiness of the 50s. Radical left political movements, students' movements, in America, also in France, you know, in the 68, all this stuff is happening. And then there's a kind of shift that moves from as the kind of the disassociation from history, the disassociation from the past of what your parents stood for, then left the space for what is it that we believe, you know, now, coincided with things like in the UK, the failure of the miners' strike and the defeat of that kind of, you know, pinnacle sort of working class movement by the Thatcher government. You had economic collapses across the world moving into the 80s and 90s. You had a real sense of a loss of meaning, and lots of those people who would have been intellectuals in the radical movements went very inward and started, you know, particularly the thing that I know most about is the women's liberation movement, where you have all these women who were out on the streets in the 60s and 70s demanding equal rights, demanding, you know, access to work, demanding childcare, you know, all these material things, suddenly start writing books about gender, suddenly start holding conventions about political lesbianism, you know, everything starts becoming incredibly, you know, out of touch with normal life, basically. And it becomes academic, it becomes insular, and actually I make the argument, I think in the book, or I have since, that I think feminism and the early women's liberation movement that turned into feminism is really the birthplace of identity politics, where you start to have this sense in the West where anything radical or progressive or any ability to change has to come from within. So it's about the way in which you see the world. It's your identity is the most important thing, and recognizing and appreciating and seeing, you know, this term seeing, your identity is the most important thing. And so then you fast forward, you know, 40, 50 years, and you have today a kind of the way in which all of this expresses itself is a really hyper narcissistic form of identity politics, which is that everything has to fit around my sense of myself. You know, discussions about collectives. When do you ever hear the word collective used anymore? That's like some term from left-wing kind of prehistoric history. No one talks about collectives anymore. If anyone talks about solidarity anymore, it's in a very kind of superficial hashtag solidarity thing. It's not actually in its kind of real political material sense, or its real kind of philosophical sense of a solidarity being about people, differences coming together. That's off the cards. And so I think it's the problem that we have now with PC culture or woke, whatever it is, has been long in the making. And that's you know, the birth of identity politics and the way in which it's come about, that is just one way of understanding it. There's also the rise of therapy culture. There's also the kind of destruction of, you know, material things, like the sort of destruction of left-wing movements through, you know, clampdowns from governments, a political apathy. All of this has meant that we've sort of been experiencing, I think, 20 or 30 years of nothingness in politics in the West, of, you know, how is it that you now have at the head of the supposedly the defender of the free world in America, Joe Biden, and who is, if he stands for anything, it's not positive. I mean, his history is, his political history is extremely questionable. He just repeats things now that are given to him by his aides that don't mean anything. The Democrats don't stand for anything. Trump didn't really stand for anything. He just stood against something, against this elite kind of liberal elite sense. He was a revolt against that. And then Biden's a revolt against Trump. In the UK, you've got Boris Johnson, who, it stands for a different thing on a different day. Who knows what that man thinks? He's exceedingly opportunist. And Keir Starmer at the head of the Labour Party, who's just a lawyer. He's just a boring lawyer. And how have we got to this position where there is nothing and nobody that mean anything anymore? I think that's also part of the problem. So then, because when you live in a broader political context where nothing means anything anymore, and you can't put your finger on anyone's manifesto, anyone's idea, you end up having these little assholes spilling out of universities saying, well, our idea is that we'll have, black only cake sales, or we'll have women only awards, or all this crap. And you just think, oh.
I think what it is actually, probably in some ways, it brings us back to what you were saying at the outset about free speech, that free speech is not something that, is you just have so people can say whatever the hell they want. That's not the point. The point is you have it so that you can contest ideas properly in a democracy. And I've found it interesting in the last couple of years, the last 2-3 years, when suddenly I've been in this position of having to defend free speech. And it started off as a sort of instinctive thing because, I value that ability to exchange ideas. And I also value the sort of tough-mindedness you were talking about before in terms of the working class propensity to just trade banter. I mean, for me, because I'm not from a working class background, I suppose you'd say I'm probably from an intellectual class background. My father was an academic. I'm an academic. But what it is there is an ability to be tough-minded about the exchange of ideas and opinions, and not take that personally when you have a vehement disagreement with somebody, because actually you understand that the reason for the conversation is to create better ideas than either of you will have on your own. And so I've had to go back to the bedrock of that and think through exactly what free speech is and why it is so important. And I think a similar problem besets democracy, that everybody has really forgotten how hard won it was and how anomalous it is historically, and just how grateful we ought to be for it and the sort of prosperity and freedom that it's given us all. But after 2 or 3 generations of taking it for granted, that gets lost. And then you do end up with these career politicians who stand for nothing but themselves and their own careers. And that's, I think, how we get to the point that we've got to, where nobody really has to stand for anything. They just have to look good on TV or something.
Yeah, but there's also the sense that the sociologist Frank Frady, who writes for Spiked as well, makes this point in one of his recent books, that actually democracy, and actually Mick Hume, who was the former editor of Spiked, made this point in his book, which came out just after the Brexit referendum, called Revolting, which was all about the fact that democracy, in its pure sense, in terms of what we understand it to be from ancient Greece, has never been realized, actually, that even though you have democracy in scare quotes in terms of free and fair elections, although some people contest that, free and fair elections in America and the UK, just, putting aside all issues of sort of electoral reform and the problems with the parliamentary system. But in general, people think we have democracy in the UK and in America, and actually in lots of Western countries. But the point they make, that Frady and Hume make, is that it's actually far more, that's a very simplistic way of understanding democracy. That actually we don't have democracy. What we have is a very managed, technocratic, managerial form of democracy, which is that you have this very tick box approach to it, where you just simply elect the best of the bad bunch every 4 years or whatever it is, and that's your only real engagement. And the most important part of that is that that's how the political elite or the ruling classes want democracy to be, or actually they want it even further removed, and that was the whole argument against the European Union and the UK, is that it's as much as you can take the to and fro, the complicated and muddy aspects of politics away from the hands of ordinary people by just giving them very simplistic options or giving them empty promises or whatever it is, the better. And so therefore public debate, open discussion, like decision making on a smaller level, all these kind of things the public can't be trusted with it, because what happens if you give people the ability to engage in the democratic process? They elect populists, they elect far-right people. That's how their minds work. Rather than understanding that actually people are, in Europe, there have been spates of elections for, and surges in popularity for far-right groups in Germany or in Hungary, because of the suppression of democracy. It's not because everyone suddenly decided that they hate women's rights and they really like and they are anti-Semitic and that everyone's progressive. It's more complicated than that, in the same way that not everyone who voted for Trump was a Trump fan and was a kind of like bombastic anti-intellectual fool. It was that they were expressing something much more complicated about a need for a proper shake-up of democracy. So the fear and loathing of democracy on behalf of the middle class and the political elites is today's real barrier to any kind of democratic process. And they often talk about things like bringing in citizens' assemblies, bringing all these kind of really boring technocratic ways of dealing with what they see as the problem. What we need to do is we really just need to kind of consult people a bit more. Maybe we need to have a little bit more local election, blah, blah, blah. It's really dull, and it doesn't get to the actual point, which is, if you don't have the democratic process is about having a lively public square. I mean, that's just been shut down with coronavirus for the last 18 months. And, for understandable reasons in the first part of it, but also the reluctance of Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party to reopen public life normally again is a further expression of that kind of desire to, everything's just much easier if you just contain people. It's just much easier for them if you don't ask people what they think, if you just tell people that politics is not for them, that we'll sort it. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers to political change today, is people not having a sense of trust in themselves, of being as able to think about things, think about complicated things, read stuff, learn about the stuff that they say is for experts. That's the biggest barrier today, I think.
I definitely agree with you. We need a more robust public sphere. We need more free speech. But I'm glad you're talking about how democracy nowadays is fairly limited, and we basically just vote for our leaders every 4 years or every 3 years if you're in New Zealand. And I think you referred to in ancient Greece they had awful deficits in other places. They didn't let women vote and they had slaves. But at the same time, they also had a lot of different mechanisms for involving the people, things like selection by lot. And I know Rosalind Fuller, who actually put us in touch, she's interested in this too, learning from the more radical democracy of the ancient Greeks. It sounds like you are also skeptical, like she is, of these sortative bodies, these bodies where you select people by lot and you consult with them. But I think this is one of the places where I think we were actually having a better conversation, even on the left a few years ago, that there was a space where people could think about, okay, how do you deepen democracy? And I agree with Rosalind that there are some problems with the way that these deliberative polls are done now, that they don't really give people any power. And they are kind of a window dressing exercise. But I think we could think more about how to involve people through sortition and through rotation and the kind of things you do in the battle of ideas, public meetings. But it just reminds me that there's several conversations, I think. It just goes back to the class thing. One of the other conversations we were having, not even that long ago, not in terms of sort of solidarity going back to the 60s and 70s or earlier, even things like inequality, the left was having a better conversation only a few years ago, in the wake of the global financial crisis. People like Thomas Piketty were doing very empirically grounded, sophisticated work about, okay, there's this big problem of increasing wealth disparities. How do you fix it? And with the inequality, with the economic inequality, it struck me as just very, very strong. It's a very strong argument to say that people are affected by how much money they have, you know, what their economic and social class is when they're growing up. It's obviously something that sort of brings people together, or at least, you know, if two people grow up in working class London, they're probably going to have more in common. Their lives are going to be in some ways more similar. Then that's going to say more about how their lives are going to go than their race, for example. So someone who's black and grows up poor in East London and is going to have more in common with someone of a similar economic background who's white than they have in common with someone who happens to be black but who went to Eton and became a Tory cabinet minister, you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is the whole fallacy of identity politics, which is that it is, and actually, to be fair, there are some people who now, I think, are even tiring themselves out with the kind of identity politics frame, who are starting to say things, because it's become fashionable now in a small way, particularly in the UK, to talk about class, that they, you know, that oh, identity politics is class blind. I mean, this was one of my, in the book on What Women Want, this is one of my main critiques of contemporary feminism, because contemporary feminists who argue for more women in politics, more women on FTSE 100 board or whatever it is, say that women need other women to be able to function, that we need to be able to see ourselves. And that presupposes that I have something great affinity with and feel a thread connecting me to Priti Patel or, you know, Emily Thornberry or any of these female politicians who go on about this kind of stuff, which is nonsense. I have nothing in common with those women. You know, we're completely different, and most importantly, we have completely different political desires. Whereas the guys that I grew up with in my primary school, or the boys that lived on my estate, I have everything in common with, because we had the same upbringing and our families thought the same things, and we had the same values, and what we thought was wrong was similar, and what we wanted was similar. That's the most important thing. You know, we wanted to get on and do better, and we wanted to have a good job and all that kind of stuff. That, you know, I think this is also the problem, in that the discussion about inequality, yes, can be, obviously is vital, and one of the, you know, to go back to the kind of pandemic, one of the things that got missed was the fact that the way in which lockdown measures affected working class people, or people who were you know, people on benefits, anyone who was not basically well off, it was going to devastate them, whereas everyone else was saying, you know, who was saying, oh, it's okay, work from home, didn't have bills to pay, didn't, you know, could live on a furlough scheme of 80%, which is what we pay, which is what we had in the UK, which for most people, if you cut 20% of the pay, they're off the breadline, they're into poverty, because there was a real blindness to the realization that no, people in the UK are not, you know, living in abject poverty, and it's not kind of, you know, rationing, you know, post-war kind of era, but there are a lot of people who are just about getting by, and so any kind of blip, any kind of change in pay means devastation for them. There's loads of people working on 0 hours contract, for example. So a discussion about inequality in that is very useful, but I think what it often ends up falling into, and this is perhaps because of the superficiality of the left today, is what can we do to aid people? It's a bit like charity. So we need more food banks, or, you know, one of the things that I hate most, I hate it in the UK at the moment, is the discussion about how we feed families. You know, the fact that kids need free school meals throughout the summer holidays because their parents can't feed them, or even worse, you know, there are feminists talk about girls having period poverty, about how their families can't afford sanitary towels, and it's just bollocks. I mean, it's not just bollocks. It's this suggestion that working class people are helpless, feckless, useless, unresourceful. You know, the discussion about obesity here in the UK is all centered around, you know, we need doctors to prescribe food to working class people so that they understand. It's just disgusting. It's just the most kind of, it's the most elitist, snobby view of what really, it's just snobbery of what people are capable of. And so then it has this very patronizing element to it, which is, you know, we will care for you, and not in the sense of society will care for the people who need care for it in a kind of genuine welfare state kind of collective sense. But that you will never really be at the forefront of making decisions. It's kind of what I was referring to beforehand. We will make the decisions about what you need, and what you really need is you need lessons on how good carrots are for you, because then you'll eat carrots. And you need, you know, to be taught about education, about how important it is to give your daughter tampons, because you don't really get that. You know, it's all this kind of stuff. And it links back to just the first point you made about sortition, and actually it's interesting, you mentioned Rosalind Fuller, who lives in Ireland, and I followed the recent political movement to repeal the 8th Amendment in Ireland, actually, which was a number of years ago now, which was about repealing the 8th Amendment. The 8th Amendment was about the right to life of the unborn. So it was a move to liberalise abortion laws in Ireland, to take away this part of the to take away the 8th Amendment, to mean that it gave the space to create new abortion laws in Ireland. And the process through which this happened, you have to understand, I know this is a big tangent, but bear with me. In Ireland, there would have been, for, you know, incredibly anti-abortion for years because of the influence of the Catholic Church, but also actually all parties, Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, all did not want to touch the issue of abortion for years and years and years, because it was, there had been several failed referendums previously. There was a sense that the Irish public would not want to go down that divisive route, and no politician wanted to take a stand, particularly as it, moved into the modern era. No one wanted to be forced to say, I don't like abortion. And there was a real cowardice to it. So what they decided to do was to hold a citizens' assembly on abortion. And they, picked at random a bunch of people. And they said, it has to be said, the pro-choice campaigners in Ireland were saying, just give us a referendum. We don't need the citizens' assembly. Just give us a referendum. Just put it to the people. We're ready for it. But the government said, no, we'll have a citizens' assembly. And the citizens' assembly ended up suggesting, in its advice, a referendum. So the whole thing was a big fucking waste of time, really, in terms of, and in the year or whatever it took, you had X number of 100 women going over to get abortions and hiding in the UK. You had people accessing unsafe, all this stuff has ramifications for women's freedom. And so there's this real sense in which citizens' assembly is about getting ordinary people, in scare quotes, your average person, and getting them into a room and then kind of hot housing them with information, which is actually a very artificial way of understanding democracy. It's like, we can trust your normal kind of Jane on the street only if we feed her the right information. That's and right. Linked with that is fears about fake news and all that kind of stuff. Citizens can only engage in politics if they're not an expert, if they are trained by experts, and that's also a very artificial way.
I agree with that. And that was, we had this conversation also with Rosalind when she came on the podcast, and that's my main reservation about that movement. I think that a lot of the earlier work was trying to push back against some of the more libertarian, anti-democratic libertarian thinkers who were saying the people are too stupid to make political decisions. And so then there was some, good people on the sort of liberal left, like James Fishkin, who were doing these deliberative polls, and they were trying to say, look, the people are okay if you give them information. But I completely agree with you that in various manifestations, it sort of slid into this thing where you get people for a weekend and you say, this is the good, this is the good thing. These are the enlightened views. Here's all the information on this side of the argument. And then I've read papers where they literally would measure how far people's opinions changed in the right direction, right? And of course, this is very dangerous, especially in the current atmosphere where we have
it has to be said,
strong sense of what the right answers are. But I will say I don't think we should throw out the whole idea of sortition. I think it can be done in a more neutral way. And but
it's important to.
The promise is.
It's important to make the point that in the case of Ireland, there was a landslide victory to repeal the 8th Amendment, and the people in that landslide victory were huge numbers of, it was called the Kerry farmer phenomenon, which is in Kerry in Ireland, which is, sort of colloquially known as being full of, in a prejudiced way, full of sort of these backward farmers who are just kind of like out, like living like it's still 1939. All of them voted to repeal the Eighth Amendment. So that was and I assure you, they didn't follow in minutiae every document that the Citizens' Assembly were following. They just went with their gut of what they felt was necessary in a modern society. So it was a really fantastic example of how you don't need to micromanage all of this. You just need to say to people, have a think about it, do some bloody reading, and tell me what you think. And usually people tend towards progressive change.
Well, I mean, what you need actually, I would say, is a culture where there is no sense of anyone wanting to micromanage it. I mean, you two have both done more thinking than I have about both sortition and citizens' assemblies, but it seems to me that you could have those things potentially if the real democratic culture was there, which is the culture of robust exchange of ideas, and then you could have a citizens' assembly, you could have sortition. It wouldn't really matter, because those are the details of how you implement democracy. Whereas I think, Ella, you were on the money before about it actually, having to sit in the value base that we have. We either have a democracy in which everybody can participate in deep discussion of complex ideas, or where they've had that taken away from them by elites who just say, we'll look after it for you, you just vote or just do whatever the democracy, the sort of surface level of the democracy requires of you, and that's it for you. Yeah.
I do definitely agree with you, though, that the referendum is the most direct way of doing direct democracy, because you're basically just saying to people, what do you think, of this issue? Okay, people say it's only one thing, but it's better than nothing. You're giving people a direct say. That's better than having a microcosm of the public. But I mean, the way they did in Athens, which obviously I'm not saying we should do exactly the same thing they did in Athens, but the idea there was that you have a sortative body like the Council of 500, which has agenda control. So the idea is that you have a selected body of citizens who sets up the agenda for the people to vote on directly. So we're not going to do it exactly the same way as they did in the 5th century BC, but maybe that's something to think about. Okay, we're actually kind of coming up to, we're done about 45 minutes already, I think, and I did want to talk a little bit about free speech in the universities, because that's something that concerns us both quite directly on this podcast, because we're both university lecturers. And yeah, I mean, we take a fairly pessimistic, we think it's a realistic view of what's going on at the moment. So possible solutions. So one possible solution is that we have the government coming in and trying to do something about what's happening in universities. And there's a version of this in the UK, I think, is it in Parliament at the moment, or it's being discussed again. And this is the idea, the government put out a whole paper, and I read your piece for the Critic, and you have some reservations about this idea of the government actually intervening in universities to restore free speech and things like that. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, so it's very similar to the conversation we've been having, which is that in good faith and with a very focused understanding of the problem of free speech on campus, because the first battle in all of this is and has been to get a public understanding of the way in which there is a problem of censorship on university. Because when I first started out, when I graduated, when I was still at university in 2012, 2013, there was just the idea of censorship on campus was like, it's just these right wingers who are kicking up a fuss about people. There was, people would be like, oh, the free speech warriors, it was really derided. It was just not an issue. You had the National Union of Students coming out and saying that we were all creating a storm in the teacup, that our opposition to, for example, zero tolerance policies that crack down on jokes was really just us being misogynistic and wanting women to be being grabbed rather than having a problem with, when I was at university, they banned this song called, in some university students union bars, they banned this song called Blurred Lines by Robin Thicke, which was it was like a crass pop song, like the most normal crass pop song that you could find. Most pop songs is disgusting in some way or another, and they banned it because it was like promoting rape culture, and all this stuff. And because we were opposing that, we were kind of we were wasting our time. And so the success has been now in 2021, it's pretty much widely accepted that there is an issue, that no, it's not just UKIP or the BNP or fascists who get banned on campus, which is where no platform policy originated as a kind of anti-fascist policy, but that gender critical feminists, that, you know, women who take a certain view on feminism, that anyone can really be banned now. So that's the first success. And I think people who are trying to institute government policy or bring in legislation to regulate, to defend free speech on campus, understand that, and I'm with them on that. What I'm not with them on is thinking that you can have a technocratic means of correcting this. And that really is what I think the so-called free speech bill, academic freedom bill in the UK is trying to do. So one of the things it's suggesting is having a free speech czar in government who would, you know, do what, kind of look at what's going on in universities and propose policy. I mean, a university should be intellectually free from the state. You shouldn't have government, I think, have government ministers coming in and saying, oh, I, you know, that looks a little bit like censorship, or you should really do this, or you should really do that. It's, you know, I think that's a professor or a lecturer's worst nightmare. That sounds like the opposite to academic freedom to me. And then the other suggestion is that you would prevent censorship by having the threat of legal action if someone did, you know, that you could take a university or a students' union group or whatever who's committing the censorship to court and seek damages as a speaker who'd been cancelled or something like that. So it's an incredibly legalistic way of understanding the problem, is that, and this is the kind of difficult thing, when an individual gets cancelled, that's a problem for the individual, fine, and it's very annoying to be cancelled, and it's, you know, it's politically bad and all of that stuff. But the thing that I don't really care about is the loss of that person's time. That's just one individual, you know, and you know, I play my violin for them and all of that. But the thing that I actually care about is the audience of students not being able to have a free and open discussion. That's the more important thing. The more important thing here is, sure, the speaker gets, you know, pissed around, but it's that the student body has been prevented from getting access to a resource in the form of a speaker. And so if you bring in a legal measure to say that speakers can seek damages for being cancelled, that doesn't do anything to promote the health of free speech among the student body. And actually, you know, this is the harder part for those of us who care about free speech. It misunderstands that the problem with censorship is on campus is ingrained with a sense that, you know, the only really people who do politics on campus, this is the kind of fallacy of what universities are like at the moment. Most students, and it was the case when I was at university, aren't particularly involved in campus politics, aren't particularly interested. You know, the move towards the commercialization of university, you know, in America and the UK in particular, is just like, it's like a tick box on your CV. You just go in there, you get your training. If you don't get your X number of hours a week, you complain. You know, there's been students going throughout the pandemic at the moment complaining about wanting to get money back because they haven't had, you know, there's this really kind of, there's a move away from seeing the university as a place of intellectual exploration, and it's just this like means to which you get your job. It's your means to which you signify that you are part of a particular, you know, section of society that goes to university. It's very instrumental. And so they don't care really if someone gets banned. I mean, one of the most difficult things when I was a student is running campaigns about no platform policies and sort of being like shaking people saying, you really should care about this. And then, or, you know, when I was involved in sort of voting in the students' union, we barely ever make quorum. Never, actually. Yeah. Because no one came. Why would they? Why would they come to decide and pass policy? And so you have to change the culture on campus, and government ministers and lawyers cannot and should not be part of changing the culture on campus. The people who change the culture on campus are the students and the lecturers and the staff and the people who inhabit that university. I think so much of today's problems with higher education comes from external intervention into higher education, whether it's a regulatory bodies, you know, breathing down teachers' necks, whether it's administrative staff bringing policies to police what the cleaners talk about on the notice board. You know, there's so much external intervention into, you know, even like, you know, student satisfaction surveys being given out to promote whether or not a university is good or not, and that's every lecturer's nightmare. It's like we need to have less intervention into universities. Universities should be free spaces where a lecturer can decide on a Thursday, right, you know, the exit of Afghanistan has just happened. We're going to make our lecture today about that. You know, have that kind of genuine, organic response to education rather than this very over-policed approach to it. And that's why I part ways with many people who I value very highly and who I respect, you know, on the issue of free speech on campus, because I just think this is a very wrong-headed way to fix a very complicated problem.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you about that. I mean, I certainly think the way in which the university has changed, and I've been around universities all my life. As I said before, my father was an academic. I literally grew up on the campus on which I now work. And I have seen that erode before my very eyes over my lifetime. I remember well the intellectual culture that he was part of and his colleagues were part of back then. And I loved university open days because we'd go along and everybody in the university would just bring out their favorite stuff. And it was like showing off. It wasn't come and study here and give us your money. It was like, hey, look at this really interesting stuff that we do. And it was fantastically vibrant, and you could imagine what you just said, that there's this big world event and then, you know, somebody says, right, we're going to change the course and just incorporate that. Now you've got to fill in a million forms to change the least little assessment or something, you know. So all of that is true, but just to be devil's advocate for a minute about the role of the state and the relationship with the state and the university. So I'm not sure how it is in the UK, but in New Zealand, the university has a legislative role. So the universities are brought into being by Act of Parliament. Each university, and we don't have that many of them, has its own Act of Parliament that brought it into being. And they have a legislated role to be the critic and conscience of society, which, you know, one might immediately interpret to be that they would uphold an environment in which there is free speech, a free exchange of ideas, and academic freedom, which is something a little bit different, although closely related. And then if they're not fulfilling that role, then why should the taxpayer fund them to do something else? And so I'm not sure if this is part of the UK solution, but we have a politician here, David Seymour, who would like to introduce a bill to Parliament that says that if a university does not uphold its role to be the critic and conscience of society, it will lose taxpayer funding. And that occurs to me as being a reasonable thing to say. If they're being paid to do a particular thing and they're not doing it, then why should they be paid?
Yeah, I mean, I think the system works slightly differently in the UK, but in the abstract, yes, there is a question of fulfilling your obligations. But it's just that I think that my emphasis, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I think my emphasis is slightly different in terms of I want to swing the pendulum back in the way of saying that the people who attend and work in those universities are the ones that really should take ownership over them. So, you know, there was this kind of interesting and weird example that happened after the Brexit referendum in the UK, where this conservative politician, I can't remember his name, took it upon himself because, you know, in the Brexit referendum, the universities, people who worked in the university, like lecturers or academics, were vastly in favour of Remain. It was like there was no Brexit supporters in higher education. And obviously then, because the UK voted in favour of Brexit, there was a conversation about whether, you know, education was skewed, whether there was no room for disagreement. You had all the stories coming out of, and I know many people who were Brexit supporters who absolutely kept that silent as the grave at work because they were terrified of anyone, you know, outing them as some kind of awful bigot. And so then one Conservative politician took it upon himself to write a letter to, I think it was sent to all the vice chancellors or every university, saying something to the effect of, you are going to have to address the issue of Remain bias in your institutions, and you have to do something about Brexit. And it's like, what? As a Brexit voter, you thought, no, this is not your remit at all. It doesn't matter if there is a huge bias. The government does not get to tell academics what to think, and it does not get to tell institutions what to think. And there was a righteous uproar about that. So there's a sense in which, free censorship is a problem and it's bad, and I disagree with it, but I don't want it to be necessarily outlawed, because that's a kind of a double, if a students' union group like the Feminist Society of Sussex, the university where I was at, want to have a policy of, wokery in the extreme, that you can only, you can't applaud, you can only click, you can't, all these things, that's fine. They're allowed to do that. But when it comes to the broader, that's fine. And I won't join that group. And I might start talking to the members of that group and say, you should try and overturn this policy. But it should be about, it's coming back to the democratic way of doing things. It should be about a sense of, you gather people around to your side of the argument, and you have a mass movement against things. Whereas I think that the imposition of either the threat of legal action, the threat of the removal of funding, just feels that top down. It doesn't just feel, it is a top down way of dealing with things, which doesn't empower the student body or the staff body. What I want to do is empower the people who are working at those institutions to care about this stuff.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that too. I mean, I think it's kind of, I only came to this conclusion myself as a kind of last resort, because I too would prefer that there was this upsurge of student support for free speech. But I mean, we're going to do a survey in New Zealand, the version of the Heterodox Academy campus survey, to see how free people feel. So we don't want to prejudge it, but it seems like across the English-speaking world, really the students and the staff have actually turned against free speech in a considerable way. And if this was still the 60s and there was the Berkeley free speech movement, that would be wonderful. But now we're in a place where controversial speakers come to Berkeley and there's a riot, a violent riot. So I mean, that's a real shame. And the other thing I will say is that I think that in the States, there are lots of private universities. In New Zealand and the UK, not so much. And there's where I think I kind of agree with Michael here. Like, I think there's a more powerful argument to have some kind of government intervention, just because if you're in a private university, then sure, you do what you want. And if you want to just be woke the whole time and you shut people down, that's fine. Because actually, as some left-wingers say, with some amount of truth, there are Christian schools, Christian universities and colleges in the States where they still probably have pretty restrictive policies against left-wing speakers. So, if you're doing your own thing in your private institution, that's one thing. I just think that, as Michael says, if you're a university, especially in a place like New Zealand, where there's actually legislation saying you have to enable academic freedom and you have to act as the critical conscience of society. We had a case here where it's a classic deplatforming case where there was a right-wing politician, a former right-wing politician who was actually the head of the New Zealand National Party, which is the main centre-right party, not that long ago. And he came to do a speech, and it was about Maori affairs. So, as in other places, race relations are very...
Actually, the speech wasn't even about that. He was just going to talk about...
Well, I can't remember. Michael's been deplatformed by Zoom, but I can't remember exactly what the speech.
Being leader of the National Party.
You went off Zoom for a bit, Michael. But yeah, okay. I mean, I think he's controversial partly because of his views on that topic. But anyway, the point is, the vice chancellor of Massey University, which was the university in question, she basically canceled his talk, and it became clear later by email that it was because she disagreed with his views. So I'm very anti-cancel culture. Like, I'm not calling for her head. I'm not saying people like that should be instantly dismissed or mobbed online or something, but I do think that is sort of part of her job. And so at the very least, there should be some kind of, maybe a superior should say, next time you shouldn't do that, or something of that nature.
Yeah, I wouldn't, let's put it this way.
Yeah,
I wouldn't campaign against it. I don't think it is I understand why it's being brought in, and the situation, I mean, here's the two arguments. Either you think the situation at university, particularly in universities, has become so dire and so hostile to free speech, as you say, even on a student body level, in terms of some of the protests that you see, the vast majority of protests you now see at universities are against speakers. It's very rare to ever see someone holding a sign saying free speech. If they do, they get mobbed. So you either think that it's got so bad that we just have to do something, and this bill is going to do something, or, you know, defunding people who censor is just, that's it, we've got to do something. Or you think we're actually in a longer game here. And I tend to think we're in a longer game here, where you know, put it this way, it's a bit like if you have you have two principles at play, the principle of freedom of speech, and also, for me, the principle of being hostile to state intervention, which is maybe like my libertarian side of me, which is that I, you know, do not want government. I think government overreach is one of the biggest problems in many areas of life. And so for me, and lots of the people who are in favour of the free speech bill in the UK are also libertarians, but I think seem to have forgotten that aspect of their political sides, or have sacrificed that for this. And that's a sacrifice they might be willing to make. It's not a sacrifice I'm willing to make. But it's a tricky one for people like, you know, you guys are academics, involved in university education. I think that a lot of what happens or at least what used to happen in contemporary politics, often came out of universities. So you had kind of trends that would come out of universities and then end up in the public sphere, whether, you know, you'd have no platform policies or things like that at university, and then you'd start having policies in HR in some office somewhere that was mimicking what these bloody teenagers are doing. And it's like in this weird kind of feeding way. And it's very difficult because really liked the way you put it, Michael, in terms of what university is and should be about. And like, if I can link back to what we began speaking about in terms of working class politics, the reason why going to university should be seen as a transformative part of someone's life is that you get access to ideas and things that you would never have in your normal life. So you have 3 years to dick about and like have sex and go out and get drunk and all those things that are positive and part of becoming an adult. But you also decide, I really loved English, that's why I did it. Or you decide, I really like physics, and so I'm going to go and find out about that. And maybe I'll come out those 3 years and think, Jesus, I never want to see another neutron or whatever they do in physics. I want to go and work as a bank teller or something. Or you say, actually, something's now awoken in me that I never knew existed, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life dedicated to the study of this thing, or I'm going to go and become an engineer or something. And that side of it has just been lost by what I think we've now end up, you know, saying that university is a place where people get taught the right thing to think about Israel-Palestine, or university is the place where you go to get kids to do a, you know, what are they called, consent class, so they can understand what rape is. It's like, that's not what university is about. And if you actually, this is where I start caring about fees, which is if you've got some working class kid who decides, all right, I'm going to go to university because I've heard that it means I get a better job. Or you get a working class kid that's like, I really like me, I love reading. My mum was like, you love reading, you love literature, you got to go, you'll love it. And you get there and you think, all this time and resources is being taken, that I meant to be here to get what I want out of this, is being taken up by all this other crap. And like, lecturers spend half their time making sure that, you know, they've got the right bloody pronouns in their email, that they aren't offending their students, that they're like up the backside of their students enough that they'll get a good student satisfaction survey, like you say, filling in forms for their departments and going to endless meetings about, it's just terrible, the degradation.
Very, very dismal. It's dismal. And, you know, I really hope you're right that, you know, following a long game, we can bring it back to where it used to be. I really hope that's true. I despair of it a bit, having, you know, been around universities literally half a century and seen how it's declined. And everything you say is exactly right. All of that is true, and it's getting worse.
How do you know our lives so well?
It just becomes really hard to see how this particular institution can come back now, you know.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
and on that horrendously negative note.
well,
To be realistic, you've got to be realistic. That's one of the things. You've got to actually lay out the problem, which I do applaud the people who are supporting this bill for doing, for saying there is a very real problem, which is true. There is a very real problem.
You're right too that you have to be careful and have to be pragmatic, because I think that you're right also that it could be a huge tactical blunder if they put this through, and you know, if they use it responsibly, and they, you know, there really is a case, and it has to be neutral. It has to be, if there's a deplatforming from the right, they come in on that too. That'll be one thing. If they are tempted to use it in a partisan way in any sense, then that'll be disastrous. I mean, that'll be bad in itself, but it would also give the university lecturers the, you know, give them back the role of the rebel against the government, which, you know, they always go on nowadays about how they're deconstructing views and things, but those views haven't really been dominant for a long time. But you know, this would actually give them something to talk about on that front. So before Michael gets deplatformed by Zoom again, sorry folks, we've had some issues, but I think most of the words got through. We want to thank Ella for coming on, because that was fantastic, and it's really nice.
Thanks, Ella. It's been brilliant.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, I'll stop the recording.